be presenting about morphology, but before we start, we will talk a little bit about the subsystem of language, giving a brief description of each, as well as two important topics, animal communication and applied linguistics. Let's begin with morphology. Well, morphology is the study of how words are built. It focuses on morphemes, the smallest part of words that carry meaning. For example, the word unhappiness. Un means not. Happy is the root word, and ness turns into a noun. So unhappiness means the state of not being happy. So morphology helps us break down and understand how words are built and what they mean. Next, we have syntax, which is the part of language that organizes words into correct sentences. Every language has rules that tell us how to put words in the right order. For example, in English we say, my mom is cooking dinner. But if we say cooking is dinner mon my, it's so confusing, right? Even if the words are all there. So syntax gives us structure to language so others can understand what we mean. Now, pragmatics. Well, this is about how we use language depending on the situation, the people involved, and what we really want to say. For example, if someone walks into a classroom and says, wow, it's really noisy in here, they're not just making an observation, they might actually be asking everyone to quiet down. So pragmatics help us understand the hidden intentions or social rules behind language, like sarcasm or indirect requests. Next, semantics. Well, this is the study of meaning in language. It helps us understand what words and sentences mean, and how those meanings can change depending on how we use them. For example, the word bat can refer to a flying nocturnal animal or a piece of sports equipment used in baseball. Without context, the word can be confusing, but thanks to semantics, we learn to understand meaning based on how and where the word is used. Now, phonetics. Well, this part of language looks at the physical sounds we produce when we speak. It studies how sounds are made using the mouth, tongue, vocal cords, and airflow. For example, try saying the word pat, pat, and then the word bat, bat. They sound similar, right? But the first sounds are different. The pa in pat is voiceless, there's no vibration. And the ba in bat is voice, and we feel vibration. So phonetics help us explain and compare this difference in sounds. Lastly, we had phonology, which studies how sounds work together as a system in each language. It looks at the patterns and rules that tell us which sound combinations are possible. For example, in Spanish, words often end in vowels like casa or amigo. In English, it's common to end words with many consonants like text or help. So phonology explains why certain sounds are allowed and others aren't in different languages. Now, something important to mention is that all the information is based on the book Introduction to Language. Now, let's move to something different. Animal communication. While animals can send messages through sounds, movements, or signals, we know that it's not the same as human language. For example, a dog might bark when a stranger comes, or a bird might sing to mark its territory. But these are meaningful. They are limited to specific situations, and animals don't combine ideas or create new sentences the way we do. And last but not least, we have applied linguistics. This folds take everything we have learned about language, the subsystem, how it works, how we use it, and applies to real-world situations. Now, how do these subsystems interact, contribute to language as a whole, and which is their connection between form and meaning? Well, we believe that these subsystems are like pieces of a puzzle, because they work together to create a full functioning language system, and each one plays an important role. Firstly, we have that phonetics and phonology deal with the sounds we use when we speak, which is the first step in forming words. Then, morphology takes those sounds and builds words by combining smaller units of meanings, like prefixes, roots, and suffixes.
Well, after this, we have the syntax, which organize those words into sentences, and this helps us to express more complex and structured ideas. Then we have the semantics, which help us to understand what those sentences actually mean by connecting the structure to the concepts that we want to communicate. And last but not least, we have the pragmatics. And this is the example of how meaning can change depending on the context, like who we are talking to or the situation we are in. For example, the same phrase can mean different things depending on tone or intention. By having said this, it is very clear that these systems are connected to the relation between form and meaning.
Hello everyone, this is Georgina Gonzalez speaking, and I'm going to continue with what Millaray said. Basically, the relation between form and meaning lies in that form is how we technically produce a speech. It is the vehicle. This includes sounds, words, and sentence structure, all in order to convey meaning. Without form, we wouldn't be able to organize language, and without meaning, there would be no purpose in using it. So basically, language works because the subsystems interact to connect how something is said with what it means. And this connection is what makes language such a complex and powerful tool for communication. We can back up this idea with a quote from the book An Introduction to Language, chapter 9, page 417, that says, "Language acquisition involves development in various components: the lexicon, phonology, morphology, and syntax, as well as pragmatics. These different models interact in complex ways to chart an overall course of language development." So we could say, thanks to this, that the subsystems don't work alone because each one contributes to the functioning of language as an integral system.
Well, now that we have seen all the subsystems of language, let's focus on morphology as well. According to linguistic Douglas Beaver, morphology is the part of grammar that studies the internal structure of words, from stems to affixes. In other words, morphology examines how words are formed and how they function by breaking them down into their small and meaningful components. This system has the capacity to analyze the structure of a word and how words are constructed. It really helps us to understand the patterns behind word formation, whether it's studying a prefix like on to reverse a meaning or a suffix like ed to indicate past tense. Furthermore, morphology connects closely with other areas of grammar, linguistics, and the other subsystems of language recently mentioned. It links to syntax, for example, by influencing word order and agreement, and to semantics by shaping the meanings that the words can express. Whether we're creating entirely new words or simply modifying existing ones, morphology is at the core of how we build, understand, and manipulate language. So now that we know that morphology is a structure made up of specific components and ideas, I'm going to introduce you the most important components of this subsystem of language. First, we have the morpheme. And what is a morpheme? Morpheme is the tiniest part of a word that still has a meaning. And there are two types of morphemes. We have the free morpheme and the bound morpheme. Free morphemes has the capacity to stand alone as words. For example, words like book, run, or music. These words make sense by themselves, but bound morphemes, on the other hand, can't stand alone as a word. They need to be attached to another word. These are things like prefixes and suffixes. A prefix goes at the beginning, like on in unhappy. A suffix goes at the end, like ed in played. So, as you can see, these small parts called morphemes are doing a lot of work behind the scenes to help us shape meaning in both speech and writing. Well, we have two more concepts, and it's the inflectional and derivational morphology. The inflectional morphology changes a word just a little, but keeps the same kind of word. For example, we have the word cat that becomes cats. It is still a noun. Or walk becomes walked. It is still a verb. It's just changed the tense or the number. On the other hand, we have the derivational morphology. That is when we add something to a word and create a new word. For example, we have drive, which is a verb, becomes driver, which is a noun. Or happy becomes unhappy, which changes the meaning completely. After this, we can notice that morphology is not just a structure, it is also the flexibility of language. With simple roots, we can create 1,000 of words and realities. Morphology defines how we perceive words and language. This ability helps us to understand the context of language indirectly. Authors like Beaver and Feldman have shown that morphology is not simple about the construction of words. It is about uncovering the underlying structure that connects grammar, meaning, and communication. It gives the ability to create, interpret, and adapt language in a systematical and flexible way.
Just to illustrate all those concepts a little bit better, here we have an example of a morphological analysis of the word overestimating. Overestimating is just one word, but it is divided into three morphemes, which are overestimate and ing. Over is a bound morpheme prefix because it came before our free morpheme estimate. And lastly, we have ing, which is also a bound morpheme, but this time suffix because it came after the free morpheme. Now that we know what are the parts of morphology, and we've already seen a morphological analysis, we can agree with the fact that production and understanding a language depends on morphology, because it carries the deeper and minimum amount of meaning inside of a word. And without it, we wouldn't be able to produce a speech nor understanding the way we do. This process happens in many languages. For example, sign languages are rich in morphemes. They also have root affix morphemes, free and bound morphemes, lexical content and grammatical morphemes, derivational and inflectional morphemes, and morphological rules for their combination to form morphologically complex signs. The affixation is accomplished by preceding or following a particular gesture with another affixing gesture. Inflection of signs roots also occurs in sign language, by modifying some movements of a word depending on the message. One interesting fact about morphology and actually humans' ability for communication is that when people speak or comprehend a speech, their minds are constantly analyzing and constructing words almost automatically by breaking them down into morphemes. Thanks to being exposed to the language, to creating a backup of knowledge, they look up to create words that precise the meaning of their messages. This morphological knowledge enables the speakers to recognize word families and make connections between related terms. Understanding that teach, teacher, teaching, and teachable share a common root helps both in producing appropriate words forms and in comprehending the relationships and meanings within this course. It is a useful tool that works rapidly and almost unconsciously in the speaker's mind, and even allows them to generate or understand complex words they might have never used or heard before by applying familiar morphological rules. But how does this process even happen? Well, Chinese acquisition of morphology provides some of the clearest evidence of role learning. Thanks to the book An Introduction to Language, Chapter 9, Language Acquisition, we learn that kids have natural skills to learn about morphology because they gradually get involved in the language they're learning and it allows them to infer how it is constructed. An example of it would be how common it is in English for kids to say things like "goed" instead of "went." For us to get why it happened, first we need to understand that little kids are not yet able to understand that verbs are related between their tenses, even though they get the meaning of them separately. At some point, they discover the patterns in regular verbs and their meaning, but they apply their rules to all kinds of verbs, including irregulars. Then they actually start using them the right way. This time knowing their relations with the different tenses and morphemes. And those are the main aspects of morphology. We all hope you like it, and also in the case you need it, this video may be helpful for you to understand the different types of subsystems in language, and especially morphology. Thank you for watching.